To offer this up-to-the-minute event to look at what's going on in Egypt, where the news seems to change by the minute. And we're really honored that Ambassador Kurtzer teaches at the school here and has been a wealth of information on this topic. So we're very grateful to him because, as you can imagine, he's had an incredibly packed schedule in the last few days, but he's made time to talk to our community about this event. Also on hand is Ambassador Bodine, the former ambassador to Yemen, who also teaches at our school. And she's here to, during the question and answer period, if there's any questions about the ripple effect to other Middle Eastern countries, she'll be on hand to help us with that. So that's all the introduction I'm going to do. Ambassador Kurtzer will talk for about 20 minutes. We'll go to question and answer period. And because we are the Woodrow Wilson School, we do ask that students have preference in the question period. So please hold off if you're not a student here. And if you're a member of the press, after the students have asked their questions and you do have a question, please identify yourself as such. Thanks.
Good afternoon. What Elizabeth should have said in terms of the changing nature of the crisis in Egypt is that the shelf life of any analysis is about an hour. So I will give you the analysis as of 4:30 this afternoon. You can call me later and we can do an update as we go along. This is literally true because about 15 minutes ago, President Mubarak made a public statement in which he announced that he all along had never intended to seek re-election. And that he will oversee a transition that will include constitutional amendments, and he also said that he plans to die in Egypt. The question that we're going to talk about tonight is whether or not this kind of decision by Mubarak is too little, too late. Had this speech been made Friday night, would it have made a difference? The Friday night speech, you recall, was rather defiant in nature, and it tended to increase tensions on the street rather than pacify the demonstrators. But in putting the analysis into some context, I really wanted to focus on perhaps four issues that wrap where the issues are in some kind of coherent fashion. First of all, who's hosting Mubarak? We've known him for 30 years. I've actually known him for more than 30 years. I met him first when he was vice president under Anwar Sadat. He is correctly known as a status quo leader. And I used to joke, but it was also true, that a perfect day for Mubarak was a day in which nothing happened. He has seen himself as the embodiment of Egyptian stability. The way in which he assumed power on the heels of an assassination that was orchestrated by Islamic extremists tell us a great deal about his outlook with respect to stability and with respect to the problems of Islamic extremism in Egypt. And yet, even though we are talking about a status quo leader, over the course of 30 years, Mubarak has overseen what can only be called transformational change in Egypt. You almost didn't see it happening while it was happening, but if you look back over the course of these 30 years, Egypt is a transformed country. My wife Sheila and I were first stationed in Cairo in 1979, and when we arrived, Egyptian infrastructure was broken, literally broken. Apartment buildings were collapsing because of the infusion of wastewater in the foundations. Electricity didn't exist. Telecommunications didn't exist. And today, Egypt has basically modern infrastructure. It has an economy which in 1980 was essentially bankrupt, almost no foreign exchange. And today, Egypt has a functioning, if not perfect economy, largely rentier-based on gas royalties and Suez Canal revenues and expatriate wages sent home by Egyptian laborers. But nonetheless, it's an economy that functions more or less. Main problem in dealing with the economy, of course, is that population growth continues to outstrip the capacity of Egypt to produce jobs. Some 650,000 or more Egyptians enter the labor force every year, and it's very hard in this economy to produce the jobs necessary for these new entrants. Not only has the infrastructure and the economy changed, but there was a transformation in the Egyptian military from a situation in which the military was totally reliant upon Soviet arms and based its doctrine on Soviet doctrine to one in which the military is now almost totally reliant on American arms and American doctrine. And what that has led to is strategic cooperation between the United States and Egypt that was unheard of and could not have been contemplated certainly before the Sadat years and even in the beginning of the Mubarak years. The best example of this would have been in 1991 when Egyptian forces fought alongside the United States in the First Gulf War, a cosmic event in Middle Eastern history to see the major Arab power fighting alongside Western powers against an Arab neighbor. And fundamental change was overseen by Mubarak over these years in the peace process. Mubarak, after all, entered office as president in the middle of the implementation of the peace treaty with Israel. Full implementation was not due to take place until about 7 months after his accession to power. And there were questions raised at the time as to whether or not he would seize upon this change of leadership as an excuse not to implement the treaty, citing popular discontent or popular dissatisfaction. And the reality is that not only was the treaty implemented on time, but there has never been, in the history of this peace treaty, a significant violation, and there has never been a significant violation of the security annex of the treaty. To be sure, it is a cold peace between Egypt and Israel, but the peace is so important that we are hearing Israeli spokesmen in the last few days relying upon the continuation of Mubarak's policies because of the importance of the treaty as an underpinning Israeli national security and Israeli interests in the region. So you have a leader who is essentially seen as status quo, overseeing an incremental but rather significant transformation, and one who has seen himself as responsible for stability, particularly in light of what he sees as a challenge from Islamic extremism. What's the army in Egypt? A lot of talk in the news these days, I would argue simplistic and probably wrong analysis on the part of many, that suggests that the army is really behind the people, and that the army will, after all, be a populist representative for this people's democracy that some would like to see emerge. Actually, the army consists of two armies. There's an army of conscripts. Every Egyptian is supposed to serve in the army, and the conscripts, in fact, have shown a great deal of solidarity, as you've seen in television pictures on the street, solidarity with demonstrators. But this is also an army of an officer corps that largely sees itself as the embodiment of Egyptian legitimacy. For 58 years, this officer corps has seen itself as true to the revolution that overthrew the monarchy in 1952. They have established for themselves an exalted position not only in the political order, but also in the economic order, including some very specific perks that military officers get and therefore want to safeguard. Until this time, at least to the outward appearances, the military has remained loyal to Mubarak, and that's not a surprise. Because for 30 years, Mubarak has been the head of state and therefore the head of the military. And the officer corps in Egypt largely derives its promotions, its merit increases from their association with the leader. We've heard that the military doesn't want to fire on the population, which is true. Mubarak, I am sure, gave that order. Because the military will not fire on a population in Egypt unless the population begins to threaten national security assets. Had this march, in the course of today, seemed to head towards the presidential palace or towards security sites in Cairo, there could have been a very dramatic confrontation. But Mubarak, unlike some others we know in the region, Saddam Hussein, Hafiz al-Assad, is not going to turn the army of the people against the people. And yet this is also an army that is going to do its best to ensure that it remains the arbiter of power. It is not simply going to hand over power to a mass of demonstrators and undermine a system from which it benefits and which it protects. So as we think about the Army, we need to think about it in far more nuanced and textured ways than we've been hearing on some simplistic analysis on television and radio. This Army will, in fact, fight to maintain its role as the guardian of the 1952 revolution. So far, the demonstrators have been wise enough not to force the Army into that position, and we may see a situation in which a coalition emerges in which the Army can find satisfaction that its position will be maintained and not challenged by whatever kind of government emerges. What do we know about the opposition? And the answer is we don't know much. The opposition that's out there demonstrating is largely inchoate and incoherent. No leadership cadre has emerged, although earlier today some kind of manifesto seemed to have been circulated by a coalition seeking to speak on behalf of the demonstrators, articulating positions that we've heard over the course of the week: the need for repeal immediately of the emergency laws, the need for constitutional amendments that allow for free and fair elections, reholding the parliamentary elections that were so faulty and so corrupted back in November, opening up the political system for political associations and political parties, and undergoing dramatic economic and financial reform so as to ensure that jobs could be created that would satisfy popular demands. Today, the new Egyptian finance minister went on television to say that he was suspending the collection of customs revenues in order to help feed the people who are in fact running out of cash reserves. And I could see in the immediate period ahead additional giveaways by the government in order to ease the transition of demonstrators back into their normal economic activity. But we don't know much about this opposition. The only face that we've seen of the opposition is someone who has no real standing in Egypt, and that's Mohammed al-Baradei, the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, a man who declared his interest in running for president and then returned to his home in Vienna and didn't come to Egypt until about 2 or 3 days of these demonstrations had passed. He's known by the media, he's known by governments outside of Egypt. He is largely unknown inside Egypt. That does not make him unqualified to lead, but it suggests that there is no natural leader to this movement, this mass movement that's demanding change. And in this opposition, there are organized groupings, there are NGOs, civil society groups, largely powerless until now, and there is the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamist extremist groupings that are more violent and even further underground than the Brotherhood. There's a great deal of debate in the press and the media about the role, the functioning, the vitality, the passivity of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I will share with you a personal estimation that the Muslim Brotherhood, since its founding in 1928, has had one single goal, and that is to transform Egypt into an Islamist state. And then once that goal is achieved, it's to transform and help transform the Middle East into a pan-Arab Islamist state. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, since 1928, has also been extraordinarily flexible with regard to tactics. And there have been long periods in its history in which it has eschewed violence, in which it has, in fact, even tried to participate in the political system. In fact, until the parliamentary elections of last November, some 88 members of the Muslim Brotherhood, although not called members of the Muslim Brotherhood, were members of parliament, having run under the guise of a different party. So the Brotherhood has tactical flexibility, but let none of us be misled about their strategic goal, which has not changed one iota. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that they need to be kept out of the halls of power. It doesn't mean necessarily that they need to be hunted down. But it does mean that there needs to be great caution in simplistic analysis about how the Muslim Brotherhood will act with respect to power. And the question of whether or not this group will try to hijack a political reform movement for its own purposes has to be kept squarely in mind. This is something that is very much on the minds of the Egyptian military, and should a transition after Mubarak continue to rest on the military as the arbiter of political power in Egypt, one can be sure that the role of the Muslim Brotherhood will be circumscribed. Finally, U.S. options. What are they? How have we played our role? And what are the challenges ahead? First of all, the United States, for more than 30 years, has tried to achieve a balancing act of diplomacy. A balancing act in which the hard, cold interests, national self-interests of the United States have dictated a close relationship with a reliable ally, the largest, most powerful country in the Arab world. And for 30 years, we have largely succeeded. I like to tell the story. I think I've told it here once. It may be apocryphal, but the point of it is important. In 1972, when the Soviet Union had a large-scale military mission in Egypt, Anwar Sadat one day woke up and booted them out. And as the Soviet officers and conscripts were leaving Egypt, the report goes that a general was asked whether or not he was upset that the Soviet era had ended in Egypt. And the general said, well, of course we're upset, but we got 17 good years out of this relationship, and that's not bad. When superpowers do have these relationships with regional powers, as we have had with Egypt, it is an extraordinarily challenging kind of activity. Because one needs to measure the global interests, global reach of the superpower with the regional interests and regional reach of the regional power. And yet we've managed, with difficulties and with problems and with many crises, to maintain a very strong relationship with Egypt for 30 years. And so as this crisis unfolded, this administration, as any administration would have done, tried to find a way to ensure that the people of the Middle East, the government of Egypt, and even the demonstrators understood that we valued the relationship that we've achieved with Egypt. But we also have principles and values that we have tried to advance both in Egypt and elsewhere throughout the history of our country. The values of democratic opening, of pluralism, of societies where people can express their views and associate freely. And we've done that in Egypt, even during the 30 years of Mubarak's rule. Not with a great deal of success, but American diplomats, including those who worked for me when I was ambassador, had it as an integral part of their agenda to try to advance the prospects for democracy in Egypt, to try to build up civil society capabilities and institutional capacities. And so in this crisis, where there is a popular sentiment in favor of a democratic opening, the United States could not but position itself in support of democracy. And yet when you have these two imperatives, these two interests at play, you can only imagine how difficult it is to walk that tightrope. The administration has done what I think is an extraordinarily good job of finding its voice on this issue. Not without some fits and starts. Last week, for example, the announcement that we might be reviewing our aid program sent shockwaves, not only through Egypt, but elsewhere in the region. And you haven't heard that from policymakers since. And what we're trying to do is let the people of the region know that we will not walk away from an ally, a steadfast ally, but we will also expect our allies to promote democracy and change. And that's why we hear words such as the transitional movement towards democracy or the growth of democratic reforms, even in the context of a relationship with a strong ally. How long we can continue this balancing act and how well we can calibrate this message is anyone's guess. As each day passes and the challenges of dealing with the demonstrations and protests on the street become more formidable, the options for the United States become more sharply focused. An ideal outcome, which may have been available last week, of the kind of speech that Mubarak delivered today, in which he promised that he would not run for re-election but offered to oversee a transition, that ideal outcome may not be available today. And it may be that the demands of the protesters have escalated. We've seen today, for example, during this very large protest, the first large signs that have not focused on Mubarak personally, but have talked about the regime. Down with the regime rather than down with Mubarak. And if this represents a trend in the collective thinking of the demonstrators, then it will be increasingly difficult to find a peaceful way out. Now, until now, the discipline shown by the army and the discipline shown by the demonstrators has been extraordinary. Sure, there have been casualties, probably upwards of 100 killed. Many of them in the first days of the demonstrations, when the police, using excessive tactics, engaged in activities that ended up in fatalities. But both sides have been very careful to try to avoid confrontations. But at the same time, as these confrontations are being avoided, the political choices are narrowing, and therefore the outcomes available are also becoming much more difficult to achieve. Will the population, will the demonstrators accept Mubarak's pledge not to run for re-election, the pledge he made this afternoon, this evening in Cairo, and return to work on the belief that he will oversee a democratic transition? We can talk about that during the questions and answers. I think there's good reason to be skeptical. Will the demands escalate now for Mubarak to leave immediately? And will that demand include a demand that Mubarak actually leave Egypt? It's also quite possible. And Mubarak signaled that on this issue of dignity, on the issue of where he plans to die, he does not want to be seen getting on an airplane or even getting a 21-gun send-off that King Farouk got in 1952. Thank you very much. So I suppose you're now supposed to line up for questions, or if I answered all of them, thank you very much. It's good to talk to you. But I guess if you line up, precedence is given to students. I will be meeting separately with press afterwards, so you don't have to waste your time now on the questions. And they can be comments as well as questions. Come to the mic. Yeah. Yeah, come down to the mics. There's 2 mics down here, because they're taping this for the website.
Hi. How viable are any prospects for success for Omar Suleiman in a leadership position now that any popular support he may have enjoyed has been tainted to some extent by Mubarak's appointment, or his appointment by Mubarak as vice president?
Look, for 30 years, Mubarak declined to appoint a vice president, believing that it was not necessary, and it looked as though he would continue not doing so. So the fact that he has appointed a vice president, and it is Omar Suleiman, is actually quite significant. The fact that he did that, however, has now, in a sense, associated Suleiman with the choices that Mubarak faces. I think in simplistic terms, had Mubarak appointed a vice president and found a way out the door immediately, the transition might have been able to be achieved. It's going to be much harder now. Now, that said, Omar Suleiman is a quite credible figure in a number of respects. People tend to disparage his credentials because he's coming from the intelligence community. The intelligence community has been tarnished in Egypt because of allegations of human rights abuses. But he has also been used on very sensitive missions, diplomatic and other missions abroad, and has performed quite admirably in support of Egypt's interests. If he gets a chance to lead, he could end up being quite a positive leader intent upon overseeing change. I'm hearing from Cairo that he is taking quite seriously the mandate that he has been given to achieve constitutional reforms, to bring about a national dialogue. There are conversations behind the scenes between Omar Suleiman and the population and the demonstrators. The question is a matter of time. Have we passed the moment in which his credibility is still intact enough to oversee this transition and succeed Mubarak? And that's a question that still can't be answered.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Mubarak's son, given some people say that Mubarak's health is very fragile, is his son trusted by the military? Is he from the military? And just a side note, what kind of communication might be going on between Israel and Egypt, covertly or I'll take my question and go upstairs.
Sure. There's been a lot of speculation and some reality to the idea that Mubarak was grooming his son Gamal to succeed him. Mubarak himself, over the past decade, consistently denied this. Still, the speculation continued. Gamal, having returned to Egypt from a banking career in England some 15 or so years ago, has been quite involved in grassroots politics within the National Democratic Party. And then it became anybody's choice as to whether or not Gamal had a chance to succeed his father. One view suggested that the military would support Gamal, even though he is not of them, because it was an opportunity to begin a transition to civilian rule with someone that they could trust. And there was another view that suggested that once Mubarak left the scene, Gamal would end up as essentially a non-entity and would have not achieved enough significance in his own right to aspire to the presidency. That debate was interesting. Had I been asked this question 11 days ago, I would have given you a personal analysis that I didn't think Gamal Mubarak had a chance to become president. I've said that consistently since I left Egypt in 2001. 11 days later, I can say with great certainty that Gamal Mubarak will not become the next president of Egypt. On the second question, there is no doubt that there are communications underway between Israel and Egypt. The concerns that Israel has about the crisis in Egypt are real. The dangers are real. And it has led to some rather dramatic changes on the ground. Just to give you one example, in 2005, when Israel redeployed its forces and withdrew its settlements from Gaza, the question was what kind of relationship it would have with Egypt with respect to containing the security aspects or dealing with the security aspects of the disengagement. And the Egyptians asked at that time if they would be allowed, contrary to the elements of the peace treaty, to move some of their armed forces to the Egyptian-Israeli border, and the Israelis preferred not to violate the treaty. In the last 2 or 3 days, Egyptian forces have in fact moved to the Egyptian-Israeli border and have moved to Sharm el-Sheikh with Israel's consent because of Israel's concern about a spillover effect of the demonstrations in Cairo. Now, given the fact that this treaty has worked so well for 30 years, we tend to take it for granted, and I suggest that we not. The fact is that an extraordinary event has happened with an agreement of two sides to essentially override treaty provisions because of a crisis. And I think that tells you a great deal about how concerned Israel is, but at the same time it also tells you a great deal about the degree to which the two sides are finding ways to cooperate.
So actually that was one of my questions. I was wondering also,
I can give you the same answer too.
in terms of the future of the military, do you think their role will be, or they want a role like that in Turkey, which is sort of, somewhat above politics, but gets to select out those they think are undesirable, particularly Islamists? And you've touched on this before. What has been the reaction? I guess it's also a question for Ambassador Boheen. What has been the reaction from other Arab states about how the United States has responded? They feel like we've responded reasonably. Is this a bad signal for allies? Thank you.
On the first question, the importance of the situation for the Army is to ensure that the system that was introduced after the revolution in 1952 remains intact. There could be a great deal of flexibility with respect to how the system plays itself out. For example, about 7-8 years ago, Mubarak appointed essentially a technocratic, professional, reforming economic cabinet. Ministers, both from the private sector and from previous government experience, whose mandate it was to achieve significant economic reforms. The military said nothing, and behind the scenes probably gave its okay, provided that the issue of stability was kept front and center. In other words, as long as these reforms would not themselves be destabilizing, the Army, in effect, didn't take a position. Whether or not that qualifies as the same Praetorian role as the Army in Turkey has exercised for 90 years or more, I'll let comparative analysts make that judgment. But it's not an army that necessarily needs to govern every aspect as long as the key levers of control ensure the continuity of its mission and of its status within the society. On the second question, and Barbara, if you want to, I can take a first crack at it. There's been a mixed reaction from the Arab world, but largely concern that the early statements by the United States had leaned too far away from Mubarak and too close to the demonstrators. In other words, from our other friends in the region, there was a concern that we were sending a signal of inconstancy in our relationship. And I think as part of what I call the calibration of our public message, I think we kind of found a better path to follow. That said, I think Washington has also received messages from others in the region, including friends who have tried to analyze the situation and suggested that we find a way to get a little bit further ahead of the curve and not react to events. But unless you have a different view, Barbara, I think the main view in the region is don't throw Mubarak overboard. Don't throw the baby with the bathwater overboard. In other words, if you have to distance yourself from Mubarak a little bit, make sure that the solid relationship between Egypt and the United States is maintained.
I just returned from a week in Cairo and the opportunity to hear the comments of Anwar on Rashid being discussing his reluctance to speak with the regime. And I was just wondering how significant is it that what are the motivations behind the opposition selecting al-Baradei as their figurehead, and what can be expected from the unified opposition?
I don't know if they're well thought out. You may know more than I on this, having just been there and talked to one of the opposition leaders. I don't think there are well thought out reasons why al-Baradei has emerged as a kind of what I call the face of the opposition. The fact is that in large respect, the news media know who he is, and he has been accessible. And you know, most of us are on a 24-hour news cycle, and you're looking for people who are going to be the talking head. Number one. Number two, the Egyptian repressive measures over the years have largely decapitated much of what would have been other opposition groups. Ayman Noor himself, who contested the presidential election 4.5 years ago, was imprisoned. And although he's out of prison now, the fact is that that kind of activity sends a chill through civil society. Do you really want to put yourself forward as a leader, and you may not go home that night? You may end up in a prison. So I think it's both a push and a pull. al-Baradei, from his side, wanting to assume this role, others perhaps a bit reticent to put themselves forward, and a media that's hungry to find someone who presents him or herself as a leader, and they found it in the person of al-Baradei. Okay. Let me introduce the next questioner. And I do this carefully. Will Wagner is actually an expert on Egypt, and will be working on Egypt in the next few months. And I have benefited from his analysis in the last couple of days. So now you have to ask me. Now the question has to be both brilliant and a softball. That's what
Well, thank you very much. That's really nice of you to say. My question was on the extent to which you think U.S. statements now aren't going to impact the decision-making calculus of the regime in Egypt. Because it seems to me that Mubarak at this point, who is going to be so consumed with trying to maintain internal stability and reestablish order, is probably not caring all that much about what Obama's immediate statements are about creating a managed transition and a dialogue and that sort of thing. So I'm interested to hear what you think about the extent of our power to shape events there, and what might be going on with discussions with our Representative Frank Wisner.
Sure. Henry Kissinger was quoted earlier today as suggesting the United States stop talking, which is, it's not really an option for the United States. So it's a bit unrealistic to think that the United States is not going to pronounce itself. But there is a wisdom in at least the sentiment, because having achieved what I think is a relatively good public position, we have found space within which the various forces within our own country are comfortable in the degree to which we've maintained our commitment to an ally while also maintaining our commitment to values. We probably don't want to start leaning in one direction or the other. That said, the degree to which we can be influential will be largely determined by what we do privately, not so much publicly. And in this respect, the dispatch of former Ambassador Frank Wisner, I think, was a rather intelligent move on the part of the administration, because it signaled to the Egyptians that we weren't going to communicate only through the airwaves, that a trusted interlocutor, Wisner served in the late 80s for 5 years as ambassador, had developed a very strong relationship with Mubarak, and also a very significant posture within general society. Very interesting man. I think the dispatch of Wisner, well, I say interesting in a positive way, Wolfgang. Yeah. Yes, and a Princeton graduate. Yeah. I think it was a very smart move, because it did allow Mubarak to hear face-to-face, quietly, without the loud external noise of microphones, what was on the American mind. Once the history of this is written, I don't know how much what Wisner said was influential in Mubarak's decision-making with respect to what he said tonight. In most of these cases, we tend to exaggerate our own role. After all, we focus on the American role, so we tend to exaggerate it. But I think we do carry some weight in Egyptian decision-making as long as we handle that role properly. Another traveler from Cairo.
Well, no, actually, I never ended up going.
Oh, you didn't go? Okay. Never mind. Okay.
But I was wondering, you've spoken about the impact that the president will have on Egypt's relationship with Israel and with the U.S. I was wondering if there are any other treaties or international agreements, particularly within the Arab world, that might be at jeopardy based on these events, like how the Arab world is reacting and are they supporting the people in the war, et cetera.
The only two international obligations that come to mind immediately are the Arab Defense Pact or treaty that's associated with the Arab League. And it's really never been activated in a serious way. As regimes have changed in the Middle East, people have either given lip service to their mutual defense obligations or they've ignored them, but nobody's paid much attention to them. The international treaty that's far more interesting and has garnered some interest relates to the freedom of navigation through the Suez Canal. I think it's called the Treaty of Constantinople, if I'm not mistaken. And there is no indication whatsoever that a successor government in Egypt would in any way impede on the freedom of navigation of that canal. Egypt, as you know, nationalized the canal in 1956 in a situation in which at that time the British said they couldn't, that the Egyptians couldn't run it themselves. And the Egyptians have run it fairly well, except for the period it was closed between 67 and 73. You know, the degree to which they earn income, I don't even know the current income, but I've heard very large numbers in the multiple billions of dollars. The degree to which the income derived from the Suez Canal is critical for Egypt. And the degree to which Egypt's international standing will be affected by the degree to which it maintains the integrity of the canal, I don't think the Treaty of Constantinople is in any danger. Those are the only two international obligations other than the Egyptian-Israeli treaty that I think come into play. Yeah.
Two questions. First off, how do you see the cooperation between the Muslim Brotherhood and the secular protest movement, how it stands currently and how it is going to evolve going forward? And then second, news stories have reported some prison breakouts or prisoners being released. How much of that is a breakout, or is it the government letting the prisoners out, and what does that signal?
Look, on the first question, I think, as I suggested earlier, the tactical flexibility of the Muslim Brotherhood has led them to associate themselves both with the larger demonstrations and also to associate themselves with the leadership pretensions of el-Baradei. I think they understood that if they put themselves forward too early, it would give Mubarak and the security services an excuse to crack down. I gather that for the first 8 or 9 days of these demonstrations, there was an assumption widely held within the government that this was in fact a Muslim Brotherhood stimulated set of demonstrations. I think that's not the case, but had the Muslim Brotherhood stepped forward and presented itself as leadership, the regime would have said, "We've told you so," and they would have gone after everybody, including the demonstrators not associated with the Brotherhood. So I think this tactical willingness on the part of the Brotherhood to subsume its own role and to play behind the scenes is what has led it in the direction that it has gone over this past week. Remind me of the second question, please.
The prison breakouts.
Yeah, you know, there was this period of 3 or 4 days, the breakdown of law and order. After the first few days of the demonstrations, the police were withdrawn from the streets of Cairo, and not unexpectedly, criminal elements and individuals decided to take advantage of it, and houses were looted and stores were broken into, and there was a prison break. It has led to the theory, which is also a devil's theory, that in fact the police withdrew in order to allow this vacuum that would then give them an excuse to go in and clamp down again. There's an alternative view which has come out of Cairo, which I tend to credit more than the devil's theory, which is that the police overreacted in the first few days. You remember there were anywhere between 38 and 50 fatalities in the first couple of days. And it led to a huge fight within the upper echelons of the government. And the Interior Minister was essentially told, "Get your guys off the street, they're doing a bad job." Now, in some ways, that was also a testing period for the demonstrators, because had they used that vacuum, had the demonstrations, not just the individuals who were looting or the prison, those who broke out of prison, had the demonstrators used that period to run amok, we would have seen a much different playing out of this crisis. But in fact, what you did see in Cairo was the beginning of the initiation of neighborhood watch, as it were, and in some cases fairly sophisticated, using signals to make sure everybody was still on duty and passwords to make sure that people could get into and out of streets. So yes, still a problem of law and order and lawlessness on the streets, but a far milder situation than I think would have been expected under these circumstances.
My question is about whether the regime includes the 444 members of Parliament, many of whom are members of the National Democratic Party and have benefited from the crony capitalism that arose both with the Dodds policy and also under the economic reform and structural investment program pushed by the IMF and the World Bank. If people like Ahmed Ez or Hisham Talat Mustafa, a few others who lose the sorts of projects like that in steel or in land, what would happen to corporate governance in Egypt. It's mostly small businesses, so there aren't really companies that don't engage in a lot of corruption that would have the power and the money to buy this land. So what will happen to all those MEP members? Will inequality in Egypt continue? And because the military has also benefited a great deal from that sort of corruption, what will happen if the inequality continues and people start to see that the military continues to benefit at the people's expense?
Let me divide the question, everything up to the military and then the military. I think if the reforms that are being promised and will continue to be promised don't include the beginning of the end of crony capitalism and the beginning of the end of corruption and the beginning of the end of using the political system as a way of effectively robbing the coffers of the state, then the reforms are not going to succeed, and one could only surmise that the demonstrators will find their way back to the streets sooner rather than later. In other words, there's got to be a fairly comprehensive overhaul. It may not happen overnight, but one would see early signs of it with respect to government policy on the allocation of contracts, transparency in economic activities, and the like. I'm not absolutely persuaded that that kind of overhaul is going to apply to the military in the first instance. You know, the military in Egypt not only has all the attributes that I indicated earlier, but it's also one of the largest economic sectors in society, with its own factories, agricultural production, usually under the guise of a civilian cover. And I would think that those are going to be among the last areas that the reformers will be allowed to touch, if they're allowed to touch at all. That said, if the reforms start working on that big area of the crony capitalism, they got enough work to do for a couple of years before they face up to the problem of the army. And this would have been seen in a couple of years as a successful transition period. Big challenge, though.
How strong is the potential for UN intervention or action by other international organizations? I was able to leave the country on Sunday, but even as early as Friday, when rampant crime and chaos in the streets became an increasing reality, there were concerns about continued access to food, cash, basic provisions. And I know that as certain areas of the city become set under military lockdown, particularly around the presidential palace and other strategic locations, there is increasing concern about access to food, water, to all those necessities.
Yeah, if you're talking about military intervention or intervention to provide humanitarian assistance, I think the chances of that are close to zero. First of all, I don't see many countries lining up that would want to do it, and I can't imagine a circumstance in which Egypt would allow foreign forces, even international forces on its territory, to carry out those functions. If you're talking about an increase in assistance, then that's likely if the reform efforts are seen as serious. I haven't seen the report, but I heard that the EU announced even today, late today, that it was ready to increase its assistance in certain sectors if the reforms would be carried out accordingly. And if that's the case, you may see both EU assistance and even American assistance now reoriented towards supporting a reform effort rather than doing business the traditional way.
I just arrived from Egypt on January 1st, hours after the bombing in Alexandria. And as a Coptic Egyptian, our main concern is that the even more important than economic policies is the rise of radical Islam empowering Egypt. And in light of the recent political prisoners that are running free and the chaos, how do you, I just wanted your opinion on the religious situation and how you see it unfolding?
Well, you know better than I, it's bad and it's not getting better. There have been Muslim Coptic tensions in Egypt for generations, and There's never been a serious commitment on the part of the authorities to regulate them, to moderate them. Periodic violence directed by, in most cases, the Muslim community against the Coptic community have traditionally been met by a less than significant response by the government. So this is a problem with very, very deep roots in Egypt. Will it become part of an overall effort at changing the way Egypt does business now? The answer is I don't know. It cuts to, again, as you know better than I, it cuts to the heart of some of the most sensitive issues in the country. And I don't know if another government is going to be able to tackle that while also dealing with the profound economic, social, and political issues.
Thank you for your time, Ambassador. I think my question might be a bit premature, but I can't help but think about the long-term lasting political legacy of this demonstration that's going on right now. And my question is, the demonstrations on the surface seem much more like anti-Mubarak protest than any sort of pro-democracy, pro-political reform sort of theme rising out of them. And my question is, to what extent do you think that this demonstration will be able to transition into some sort of lasting political reform? And I can't help but think of certain parallels, particularly in East Asia during the late 1980s, where we saw similarly sort of countries that had a similar legacy of decades of sort of stable rule and strong economic growth, and a sudden surge of popular uprising, not just among intellectuals and students, but across all sectors of society. And to what extent do you think that the sort of intellectual force of the elite and the college students in Egypt will be able to sort of capture the momentum, the society-wide momentum of the demonstrations right now?
It's a great question, and whenever anybody tells you that you've asked a great question, it means that he doesn't know the answer right away. He's buying time as he thinks. Look, the reality is exactly as you described it. You have this very inchoate mass of people who know what they don't like. They don't like Mubarak. They don't like the fact that the jobs aren't available. They don't like the inequalities. They don't like the fat cats running around town as they're struggling to make do on a couple of dollars a day. But there have not been channels of expression for them in the past to articulate what they want. And it's impossible in the course of a 10-day demonstration for that kind of a programmatic response to hunger and poverty and social inequality to develop. So the real challenge now, I mean, I've been talking today about the challenge that the government, the next government, will face in addressing reform demands. There's an equal challenge, as your question suggests, in the reformers articulating what it is that they want and what are their priorities. If the demands become more than a government can handle, does that become a reason to go back out on the street? Or will there be an understanding that any kind of reform effort is going to be gradual and incremental by virtue of its very difficulty in achieving? And there's no simple answer for it. Egypt is, in some respects, not going to be able to learn as much as it might have from the Asian experience, because Egypt has tried fairly unsuccessfully to adopt what might have been called at some points a China model of political repression but economic freedom, but it didn't have the wherewithal to achieve it. So it was a failed model. If that's what they were trying to do, it was a failed model, and therefore, what do you replace a failed model with if you don't have the makings of an alternative, a potentially positive model? That's the long way of saying it really is a good question, and you have to hope that civil society activists and others, when they go home at night, at whatever time they go home in Cairo, are giving some thought to this, because the last thing you want is for them to show up at a dialogue with Omar Suleiman and they don't know what they want, and they end up having to defer to government priorities. Okay, we got the last question coming.
Well, I hope I'm not taking the stage from a student. My apologies if I am. I understand that there were some changes made in the Jordanian government today, and my question is really more regional, and what sort of impact do you think we're going to see on the bigger picture than that region and the other governments?
Barbara Bodine, come on down.
I thought I was going to escape. Thank you. That's a very good question. Yes, I saw the same report that the Jordanian, the King Abdullah just dismissed his entire cabinet. I think when we're looking at, do you remember Tunis that started this? It's interesting, no one's mentioned Tunis at all. The question that I've been getting is, is this going to stay within Egypt's borders, or is it going to spread throughout the entire Middle East? And I think that's kind of a false choice. It's clearly not going to stay within Egypt's borders, but I don't see a major domino effect, cascading sort of eastward and westward. That said, within the last couple of weeks, we've seen two of the most autocratic leaders. One has already left, and one is looking for a very graceful way to step down, if not move out. And that is going to change the whole way that both the governments and the governed look at each other in the Middle East as they try to sort out what does it mean for us here. No head is going to sleep very comfortably tonight, but I don't see massive demonstrations. I think what you're going to see, as we saw in Jordan, you're going to see some governments trying to get ahead of the curve, trying to address what is a common theme in Tunis, Egypt, Jordan, and in Yemen, which is really jobs. This has not been driven by Islamicists, even if they will try to take advantage of it. Trying to get ahead of the jobs issue, try to get ahead of the economic issue, try to get ahead of some of the corruption and cronyism issues. Watching both Tunis and Egypt on the efficacy of the use of force or not. Agreeing to demands at an early enough stage or waiting so long that you have to leave. So I would also note that the Jordanians change their cabinets fairly often. So I would also not overread it. The life expectancy, that's too dramatic. The job security of Prime Minister in Jordan is never been very great. But it is going to have a ripple effect. It has changed the nature of the conversation. And I think the more autocratic the government, the more worried they are going to be. But even those that have a more tolerable social contract, let's put it that way, they are still going to be recognizing that they need to listen more carefully. And I think the people are going to understand that they can make their voices heard much more effectively. Another major element of why this is going to inform but not domino has just been the role of the media. You've had demonstrations before. You haven't had a major revolution really since Iran, but now it's all on television. It's all on Al Jazeera. And so now, if you're sitting in Yemen, sitting in Jordan, sitting in Morocco, sitting in Oman, you can watch this. You can watch it real time, and you can watch it in your own language. So it has changed the nature of the conversation, it's changed the nature of the relationship, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be dominoes.
Thanks.
Okay, so we can please stay in your seats until our speakers have left, and please help me thank them for doing that.
I'd also like to ask, if you're not on our e-newsletter, to please sign up over